They tell you the world runs on trust, but what if it actually runs on one currency? For decades, oil, trade, and power have flowed through a system most people never question, until one man did. Muammar Gaddafi didn't threaten the world with weapons. He threatened it with an idea, a currency backed by gold, trade without the dollar, an Africa that could price its resources on its own terms. And the moment that idea moved from theory to action, everything changed. The headlines hardened, the alliances shifted, and a country that once stood stable was suddenly labeled a problem. So here's the question history avoids. Was this about politics or about money? Because some ideas don't get debated, they get buried. Let's find out. Every global system survives on one unspoken rule. Some ideas are allowed to be discussed, but never acted on. The gold dinar broke that rule. For decades, Africa sold its oil, minerals, and labor through currencies it did not control. Value left the continent the moment it was created, while debt stayed behind. This wasn't an accident, it was design. Gaddafi understood that design and decided to bypass it. Instead of negotiating better terms, he asked a far more dangerous question. What if Africa priced its wealth in something real? Not promises, not paper, gold. This wasn't announced with fanfare. It surfaced quietly in closed meetings, regional summits, and financial discussions that never made headlines. That silence mattered because real plans don't start with applause. Libya had the reserves, Africa had the resources, and for the first time, there was talk of a system that didn't need permission to exist. That's when attention sharpened. Because once an idea threatens the foundation of how power is measured, it stops being theoretical and starts becoming unacceptable. If this already has you thinking differently, support the channel by hitting the like button, subscribing, and hitting the bell to activate all notifications. Now let's dive deeper. The gold dinar was never a slogan. It wasn't a protest symbol, a campaign promise, or a speech designed to provoke applause. And it certainly wasn't a fantasy currency meant to shock the West. It was practical. That's what made it dangerous. At its core, the gold dinar was simple, a currency backed by physical gold, intended for trade between African states and strategic partners. Not loans, not credit, not debt, value for value. Unlike fiat currencies, this system could not be expanded at will. No printing during crises, no silent dilution through inflation. Every unit issued had to be matched by something tangible, something real. And Libya had plenty of it. Gaddafi wasn't imagining reserves, he had them. Gold stored, counted, and ready to anchor a system that didn't rely on confidence in distant institutions. What the gold dinar was not is just as important. It was not designed to replace national currencies overnight. It was not meant for daily shopping or local salaries. And it was not about isolation from the world. It was about trade power. Oil, gas, minerals, and large-scale transactions would move outside the dollar framework, quietly, legally, and permanently. That distinction matters, because once international trade no longer depends on a single currency, influence begins to shift. And the moment that shift becomes measurable, it stops being tolerated. Paper currencies survive on confidence, gold survives on reality. That difference changes everything. The modern financial system runs on trust. Trust that money will hold value, trust that debts will be honored, trust that rules won't suddenly change. But gold doesn't ask for trust. It sets limits, and limits are dangerous. By anchoring trade to gold, the gold dinar would have removed a silent advantage, the ability to create money without creating value. No inflation by design, no emergency printing, no quiet transfer of wealth through devaluation. For countries rich in resources, this meant leverage returned to the source. For the system built on flexible money, it meant exposure. Because once one major trade corridor proves that real value can replace paper promises, the question spreads fast. Why are we still playing by the old rules? That question doesn't need to be answered to be disruptive. It only needs to be asked. And by choosing gold, Gaddafi wasn't challenging policy, he was challenging the foundation. And once that foundation was touched, the response stopped being economic and became strategic. Gaddafi did not announce the gold dinar to the world. He floated it quietly where real decisions are made. At African Union meetings, in closed financial discussions, and in conversations that never reached the media, the idea began to circulate. That silence mattered. Loud ideas attract ridicule. Quiet ideas attract surveillance. Libya was not acting alone. Other states listened, some hesitated, others showed interest. Oil-producing nations understood the advantage. Gold-rich countries understood the leverage. For the first time, coordination did not run through Washington, Paris, or international banks. That was when resistance appeared, without a single public statement. Investment promises slowed, diplomatic warmth cooled. Suddenly, Libya was difficult again, not unstable, not dangerous, just inconvenient. This was not punishment, it was testing. The system wanted to know whether the idea would fade under pressure, whether support would fracture, whether fear would do the work quietly. But the conversations did not stop. Instead, they became more careful, more deliberate, more determined. And when subtle pressure failed, something else began to form behind the scenes. Because systems rarely act alone, they coordinate. And once coordination begins, outcomes stop being accidental. What followed would move events beyond finance and into irreversible territory globally. The gold dinar frightened more than African finance ministries. It unsettled a global system built on predictability, hierarchy, and control. Africa was only the starting point. If African oil could be priced outside the dollar, the implication traveled fast. Energy markets rely on consistency. Once consistency breaks, alternatives multiply. And alternatives weaken dominance without firing a single shot. What mattered was precedent. One successful departure invites imitation. Middle Eastern producers would ask questions. Latin American exporters would reconsider terms. Emerging economies would explore options quietly. This was not about collapsing the dollar overnight. It was about erosion. Small shifts, gradual leaks, confidence draining away as choices expanded. Global power depends on obligation. When trade requires a specific currency, that currency remains powerful. When trade allows choice, power disperses. That is why the gold dinar was watched far beyond Africa. It was seen as a signal, a test case. A door that once opened could never be fully closed again. And systems built on control fear doors more than protests, because protests end. Precedents don't. That reality explains why the reaction was swift, coordinated, and unforgiving once momentum became undeniable globally. Timing is never accidental in global politics. Narratives appear when they are needed, not when they are true. As financial discussions quietly advanced, a different conversation began to dominate international media. The focus shifted away from currency, reserves, and trade. Attention moved instead toward morality, urgency, and emotion. Suddenly, Libya was no longer discussed as a financial actor. It was reframed as a humanitarian concern. This shift served a purpose. Moral language simplifies complex realities. It divides the world into heroes and villains, leaving little room for economic motives or structural threats. Once emotions take control, scrutiny disappears. Calls for protection replaced questions about policy. Urgency replaced analysis. Speed replaced verification. This transformation was not spontaneous. It followed a familiar sequence. First, credibility is questioned. Then legitimacy is challenged. Finally, intervention is presented as responsibility. By the time financial issues resurfaced, they were buried beneath images, slogans, and selective outrage. The original threat no longer needed to be debated. It had been obscured. Humanitarian framing did not explain events in Libya. It redirected attention away from uncomfortable questions. The global system is flexible with complaints, reforms, and dissent. It is not flexible with alternatives. Reform keeps power intact, replacement removes it. The gold dinar did not ask for inclusion inside existing financial structures. It proposed a parallel route, one that bypassed established gates and reduced dependence on institutions built to supervise compliance. That distinction mattered. A system can absorb criticism. It can adjust rules, offer concessions, and delay outcomes. What it cannot tolerate is redundancy. Once an alternative proves viable, leverage evaporates, influence weakens. Enforcement becomes difficult. That is why negotiation was never on the table. Negotiation assumes shared rules. Replacement rejects them. The response therefore targeted capacity, not argument. Coordination was disrupted, continuity was broken, confidence was undermined. Without infrastructure, ideas stall. Without stability, systems cannot launch. This approach leaves no martyr and no debate. It leaves confusion, fragmentation, and silence. And silence is effective, eventually fade. And once attention moves, consent quietly forms. Because wars are rarely sold as economic decisions. They are sold as moral necessities globally. After Libya collapsed, the conversation ended, but absence told its own story. Institutions that once coordinated policy no longer functioned. Records became opaque, oversight dissolved. The mechanisms required to manage large-scale financial initiatives simply vanished. Gold reserves were no longer discussed with clarity. Asset management shifted into legal limbo. International freezes hardened into long-term paralysis, preventing recovery rather than enabling it. Decision-making fragmented among competing authorities, none able to execute national strategy. What disappeared was not a proposal, but capacity. Planning requires stability, data, and trust. All three evaporated. Engineers left, administrators fled. Technical expertise scattered across borders. Projects stalled without formal cancellation. In that vacuum, attention turned inward. Survival replaced ambition. Emergency governance crowded out long-term design. Every delay compounded uncertainty, and uncertainty kills coordination. The result was predictable. No alternative framework could advance without a state able to anchor it. No regional initiative could proceed without a functioning center. Momentum died quietly, not through refutation, but through exhaustion. This outcome mattered beyond Libya. It demonstrated a method. Remove coherence, and ideas collapse on their own. No confrontation required. No explanation offered. Just disappearance. That lesson lingered quietly, shaping calculations everywhere, long after cameras moved on elsewhere globally today. Systems fear memories more than threats. Libya left a memory that never faded. The gold dinar failed to launch, yet its logic survived. It proved that alternatives do not need permission. They need alignment. That lesson unsettles institutions built on monopoly. Today, similar conversations are resurfacing under different banners. Countries discuss settling trade in local currencies, reducing dollar exposure, and diversifying reserves. The language is cautious, technical, and deliberately unprovocative. BRICS enters here quietly, not as a replica of Libya's proposal, but as evidence that multipolar payment routes are no longer taboo. Incremental steps replace grand announcements. Pilots replace proclamations. Plausible deniability replaces confrontation. What alarms the system is continuity. Ideas once dismissed as reckless are now framed as risk management. What was isolated is becoming networked. What was loud is now disciplined. This time, there is no single figure to isolate, no capital to destabilize, no center to fracture. Coordination is distributed, timelines are patient. Libya taught a costly lesson about speed and visibility. Others learned it. That is why vigilance remains high, because the question is no longer whether alternatives can exist, but how many can mature at once. Without provoking collapse or inviting attention again worldwide today. The question was never whether the gold dinar would have worked immediately. Systems are not threatened by experiments. They are threatened by trajectories. What unsettled decision-makers was direction, not readiness. A gold-anchored route pointed away from managed dependence toward autonomous pricing. It challenged who sets terms, who absorbs risk, and who captures value. That is why the response arrived early, before success could be measured. Failure would have been acceptable. Momentum was not. The unanswered question remained simple and uncomfortable. If the idea was doomed, why stop it before it began? And who truly benefited from silencing it so quickly? Africa's future will not be decided by slogans, but by structure. The lesson of the gold dinar is not nostalgia, it is sequencing. Independence requires timing, alliances, buffers, and patience. Today, African states are diversifying partners, strengthening regional trade, and rebuilding technical capacity quietly. Value chains are discussed alongside currencies. Risk is spread, visibility is managed. The goal is not confrontation, but resilience. Sovereignty now advances in layers, not leaps. That shift matters, because the next attempt will not announce itself. It will arrive incrementally, legally, and prepared, designed to endure pressure, survive shocks, and outlast scrutiny over time across generations. The gold dinar was never just a currency. It was a test of how much independence the system would tolerate. It failed, not because it was wrong, but because it came too early. And that raises one final question. If the world is now moving toward alternatives anyway, what happens when Africa returns to the same idea, this time smarter, quieter, and prepared? Because history doesn't erase ideas, it postpones them. If this story hit you, smash the like button, subscribe, and personalize the bell so you don't miss what's next. Share and hype this video to push the truth further. Support the channel with super thanks or gifts, and join our community using the join button for deeper discussions and exclusive updates.